I understand Microsoft has taken an action to get a little bit of a handle on some of the activity we've been seeing with dynamic DNS. Can you tell us a little more about it, Matt?
Yep. So this is actually kind of interesting. We found out about it a little bit earlier than most people because we were looking at DNS queries related to dynamic DNS domains, and things started resolving very strangely as of about midday yesterday to a bunch of IPs that had host names that were owned by Microsoft. And so it turns out that Microsoft took action against two particular types of malware. They call them Bindi and Jenkskus, and it took me forever to memorize those names, but we know them better as NJRat and NJWorm. So what they did is they filed suit against two of the purported actors behind the malware, as well as taking action and seizing domains owned by noip.org. Now, noip.org is a very well-known dynamic domain provider. You know, it's free for most people. They have a paid service as well, but most people take advantage of the free domains. You sign up for them. Maybe there's a client, and you tell it what your IP address is, and the domain will resolve to you until you change it.
Right.
Unfortunately, it's also, as most dynamic DNS free services are, you know, rife with abuse. Malware authors use it all the time. In particular, NJRat and NJWorm were using it for command and control. The upshot of the takeover of the domains, however, is that not only were the domains in particular that were identified as being part of NJRat and NJWorm use, not only were they taken over, but the entire, I think it was a list of 22 domains that were owned, everything under those was repointed to Microsoft. And it seems like the majority is being dropped on the floor. It's not resolving. I had heard that the intent originally was that they would be, you know, filtering out the known malicious traffic and passing the rest on as a complete, you know, transparent redirect. It doesn't seem to be the case, and there are some people on the internet. When I say some, it might be in the millions.
Right.
Just some.
Yeah. I mean, there's obviously it appears to be some collateral impact associated with this this takedown activity, but. At the same time, you know, we have seen an awful lot of cases where dynamic DNS services, a lot of these free services are being run in a way that, you know, perhaps not with as much scrutiny as necessary to really keep from being abused or malicious activity being, you know, taking place. And in fact, we've seen in some cases where it appears that hosting services, for example, are willing to accept things without really paying any attention to really what's going on. And so there's a balance here that needs to take place. And you know, and this is a case where apparently there are some consequences to the attempt to clean things up, and hopefully they'll get those things resolved. But perhaps on the other side of this is sending a message to these free service providers that they really need to be paying attention to what they're doing and making sure that their services aren't being abused.
Yeah, the fact of the matter is that dynamic DNS is heavily used by a number of threat actors, not just the ones involved with this particular malware activity, but we've seen it all over the place. We've seen it heavily used in APT as well.
Right, absolutely.
And it actually did interfere with about 25%. 25% of the activity that was disrupted was APT oriented.
Right.
Other APT, not to say that, you know, NJRat and NJWorm have some APT underpinnings, but there's a lot of other things hanging out in the noip.com space that were APT as well. Other APT groups kind of hanging out in there that were collaterally impacted by this. Not to say that that's a bad thing. It's just an observation as well.
Yeah, you know, this is only sort of peripherally related, but there was actually a study done by the Government Accounting Office. I don't know why they in particular picked this out, but this was several years ago where they were looking at the registry information or registration information associated with domain names, and found that about 30% of them had bogus information. That is completely, phone numbers that didn't make any sense, addresses that aren't real, names that didn't exist, no contact information that was valid, email addresses that don't work. And so, some of that would be erroneous, and that is, it was just simply a mistake. But a good proportion of that is they didn't, there isn't really any scrutiny associated with this. So I think this fits in that sort of that same category. That is, really DNS, domain names, really are a significant underpinning in terms of translating, to IP addresses, and the abuses of those can have implications in terms of security of systems, because we're using that as a means for that translation. So I think the underlying message here is that it is important to have good security around DNS, whether it be a dynamic DNS service, whether it be a free service or a paid service. We still need to be paying attention to it.
I agree 100%. It's we've seen a lot of these actors taking advantage of it. You know, there are legitimate uses for it too that, in this case, you know, are collateral damage.
And they aren't the only ones. You know, there's plenty of dynamic DNS providers out there. So
this is, in my opinion, this is one example of a number that are potentially contributing. In fact, it appears that even some of them might be hosted for the specific purpose of being able to facilitate some of the malicious activities that we've seen, and unfortunately not necessarily in a position where you know, U.S. legal action would be able to be taken against those. But you know, you take action where you can.